늘 남편 먼저, 늘 자식 먼저. 레이디 퍼스트라는 말을 믿고 살아온 당신. 오늘만큼은 세상 누구보다 당신이 먼저입니다.
한 분 한 분 특별하게 모시겠습니다.
Excellence in Flight, Korean Air.
It's 5 a.m. in New York, 5 p.m. in Beijing, and 6 p.m. on Thursday, the 3rd of July here in Seoul. Live from Seoul, I'm Moon Gun-young.
And I'm Daniel Chen. Thank you for joining us.
Now, we have a special programming today as for the most part of our broadcast, we will bring you live coverage of the Korea-China Summit Joint News Conference.
President Park Geun-hye is meeting with visiting Chinese President Xi Jinping at the presidential office of Cheongwade as we speak. And the two leaders will be holding a joint news conference in roughly 20 minutes or so, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. But first, a brief look at the stories making headlines on this Thursday. And of course, the Korea-China Summit tops the headlines.
President Park Geun-hye and visiting Chinese President Xi Jinping have started their summit talks in Seoul on this Thursday.
While a range of bilateral and regional issues, including North Korea's nuclear programs, are thought to be topping their agenda, the two leaders will release a joint statement and hold a press conference on the outcome of their meeting. Now, on the economic front, the two leaders are expected to agree to speed up their FTA negotiations and set up a trade market for their respective currencies.
On the second day of his state visit, President Xi will meet with National Assembly Speaker, the Prime Minister, and also address hundreds of students at Seoul National University. Presidents Park and Xi will also appeal to businessmen from both countries at an investors forum.
Well, before sitting down with President Park today, Chinese President Xi offered his thoughts on the summit in a piece that appeared in Korea's major dailies earlier this morning.
It encouraged greater cooperation between Seoul and Beijing and expressed high hopes for the summit, echoing the sentiments voiced by President Park a day earlier in her interview with Chinese broadcaster CCTV. Here's Arirang with this report.
Chinese President Xi Jinping begins his piece with a traditional Korean saying, "It only costs 3 straw bags to buy a house, but 1,000 to get a good neighbor," emphasizing the importance of having good neighbors. He goes on to say that Seoul and Beijing have been able to build a healthy relationship based on trust, adding the two should always be able to freely exchange opinions on areas of mutual interest. President Xi also calls economic cooperation the main focal point of Korea-China relations and says China is aiming to expand its economic ties with Seoul through speedy negotiations on their bilateral FTA. As for his visit to Seoul, he writes that he hopes the two leaders will share friendship, discuss cooperation, and preserve peace. His words were echoed a day earlier by Korean President Park Geun-hye during an interview with China's CCTV, where she expressed hope that the visit will bring relations between the two to a new high.
이번에 시 주석님의 방한도 더욱 그 내실화 있는 결실을 많이 거둬서 두 나라 관계의 신뢰와 또 우호 관계가 더욱 깊어지리라 그렇게 생각합니다.
When asked about Korea's ongoing historical dispute with Japan, President Park simply said Tokyo needs to have a correct understanding of history. She also accused Tokyo of trying to undermine the 1993 Kono Statement, which was its official apology for forcing roughly 200,000 women into sexual slavery during World War II.
국가 간의 신뢰를 저버리는 일이고 또 국제사회의 그 준엄한 그런 그 어떤 목소리를 무시하는 그런 행위라고 생각을 합니다. 그래서 일본은 이제라도 어떻게 역사의 수레바퀴를 되돌릴 수는 도저히 없는 것이기 때문에
Japan's recent attempts to revise history and economic cooperation between China and Korea will top the agenda of the summit between the two leaders. Yurian, Arirang News.
Now, on the sidelines of their summit, Korea and China were expected to ink a deal to allow direct trading of their local currencies.
Well, the agreement would slash transaction costs for companies on either side of the West Sea and reduce foreign exchange risks. Here's our Kim Ji-yeon with this report.
Korea and China have been trying to settle their exports and imports in their own currencies in light of their growing trade. China is Korea's largest trading partner, while Korea is China's third largest trading partner. Last year, the trade volume between the two countries totaled $230 billion, with Korea posting a $63 billion surplus. Up until now, only 1% of Korean companies settle their trading bills with their Chinese partners directly in the Chinese yuan, because only those already holding enough yuan could do so. Under the currency deal, exporters and importers from the two countries will no longer have to pay transaction fees when converting the won to the yuan, and vice versa, since there's no need to convert into the US dollar. The new arrangement is expected to cut Korean traders' business costs by at least 3 to 5%. It would also help reduce potential exchange rate risk. A researcher at the Korea Capital Market Institute says the deal will make Korea's financial market more attractive to foreign investors as well.
The deal with China is expected to enhance Korea's financial and industrial brand image with the growing use of the yuan in international trade.
The global trade volume settled in the yuan amounted to 4.6 trillion yuan, or $741 billion last year, up 58% from a year earlier. In addition to the currency deal, China is reportedly considering allowing Korean financial institutions to invest directly in China's capital markets by granting them investment quotas of up to $13 billion. China has similar quota deals with Britain, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Kim Jeon, Arirang News.
Well, the media spotlight is not just on President Xi, but also his wife, who is accompanying him on his trip to Seoul.
Well, she is almost as well known as her husband, and her fashion style in particular has made headlines around the world. Our Song Ji-san has more on China's First Lady.
She is the Michelle Obama of the world's second largest economy and has been referred to as the Carla Bruni of China for her past career in entertainment. It's Chinese First Lady Peng Liyuan, who was once more famous than her husband for her regular appearances in an annual CCTV New Year's gala. Unlike her predecessors, the former singer and performer has been outgoing and active in her role as China's First Lady. The world's 57th most powerful woman, according to Forbes magazine, is also a goodwill ambassador for the World Health Organization. Selected to the International Best Dressed by Vanity Fair magazine last year, everything Peng wears makes headlines in fashion magazines and immediately sells out. Peng is scheduled to visit palaces in the Korean capital and attend cultural events during her 2-day visit, and will be on her own for most of her itinerary while her husband holds talks. To show around the city, the presidential office of Cheongwade has tapped current senior secretary for political affairs Cho Yun-sun, who will serve as Peng's personal tour guide during her stay. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
Shifting to a different story, the pieces of an agreement struck in May by North Korea and Japan are coming together.
Apparently satisfied with the way Pyongyang is moving ahead with a probe into the kidnappings of Japanese nationals decades ago, Tokyo is going to go ahead and ease sanctions on the North. Our Connie Lee reports.
Following months of government-level talks and an agreement made back in May, Japan will ease some sanctions on North Korea. This in return for Pyongyang's commitment to reinvestigate the abductions of Japanese citizens in the 1970s and 80s. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe did not elaborate on which sanctions will be lifted, but told reporters on Thursday that this was merely the beginning of more things to come.
Under the principle of action being repaid with action, I want to lift part of the sanctions Japan has imposed. However, this is just a start.
The bilateral sanctions that Japan could be lifting include travel bans to and from Pyongyang, restrictions on how much money can be sent or brought into the communist state, and port calls by North Korean ships to Japan. In 2002, North Korea admitted to abducting 13 Japanese citizens in the 70s and 80s to help train their spies. Pyongyang called the case closed after returning 5 people back to Japan and declaring that the 8 others were dead. However, Japan has since disputed that and believes even more people were kidnapped.
The abductee issue is a very serious human rights issue and something specific to our country.
Now in 2014, North Korea says it is launching a new committee to look into the case. And according to the Sankei newspaper, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un will oversee it.
We have been informed that North Korea has completed its preparations and is ready to begin, so we think they indeed will do so.
Connie Lee, Arirang News.
Well, Pyongyang isn't ready to take no for an answer. Less than 2 days after South Korea turned down a proposal out of Pyongyang to end all cross-border hostilities, North Korea has reached out again.
A piece published Thursday in the North state-run Rodong Shinmun newspaper said Seoul should take the North's peace offering seriously rather than questioning its motive. North Korea on Monday proposed that both Koreas stop slandering each other and suspend all military hostilities. Seoul turned down the offer just 1 day later, calling it nonsense and insincere.
Digging deeper, getting to the bottom of stories that impact your life. Talking with you on air and online. Connecting you with experts on the world's most pressing issues. News and current affairs at its best with Moon Gon-young and Daniel Che on Early Edition at 6.
Now, shifting to domestic news for a little bit, President Park Geun-hye's plan to reorganize the government following April's ferry disaster that left more than 300 people dead has hit a snag. The goal was to put a bigger emphasis on safety issues, but opposition to the plans has picked up. Which side will prevail? Our Kim Young-gil might have some answers.
President Park Geun-hye has vowed to disband the Korea Coast Guard over its poor handling of rescue operations as the Seoul ferry sank. In its place, the president wants to create a new government body charged with safety and rescue affairs under the office of the Prime Minister, which would serve as the control tower in future disaster situations. Under the plan, the Coast Guard and the National Emergency Management Agency will be absorbed into a new government agency on national safety. But the main opposition New Politics Alliance for Democracy has already registered its objections to the plan. Instead, it has proposed keeping the Coast Guard and the National Emergency Management Agency intact and establishing a full-fledged safety-related ministry. It also suggested the National Security Council under the presidential office become the control tower of all disaster and safety-related issues instead of the Prime Minister's office. Under the NPAD plan, the Coast Guard and the National Emergency Management Agency would still be responsible for safety issues, including rescue work at sea and on land. The party is also calling for a removal of the Coast Guard's authority over investigations and intelligence gathering on land. However, the ruling Saenuri party is unlikely to give in to the NPAD's demands. It says the opposition's opinions will be heard, but that more weight must be given to the government's plan. Kim Young-gil, Arirang News.
Well, this shouldn't come as a big surprise, but it's an interesting indication of the sentiment in Korea following April's ferry disaster. The number of people taking trips by ship tumbled 26% in May from a year earlier. Well, the Ministry of Oceans and Fisheries says that is a drop from nearly 2 million to 1.5 million passengers. And in particular, the number of ferry passengers to Korea's southernmost Jeju Island plunged 47%. The ill-fated Seoul ferry was en route to the resort island when it sank off Korea's southwestern coast. The ministry attributes the overall drop to public fear of ferry travel after the tragedy, but also to the Seoul's operator Cheonghaejin Marine Company being suspended from operating the Incheon-Jeju route.
In another story, Korea's foreign exchange reserves hit another all-time high in June, the country's 12th straight record-breaking month. The Bank of Korea said Thursday the nation's foreign exchange reserves stood at $366.55 billion as of the end of June. The figure is up more than $5.6 billion from the previous month. The central bank attributed the jump to issuances of foreign exchange stabilization bonds and the strengthening of the euro. Korea was the 7th largest holder of foreign reserves in the world as of the end of May. In Korea, when one large retailer opens in a given area, about 22 small mom-and-pop stores are forced to close down. This is according to a study published by the Bank of Korea on Thursday, which shows that the opening of one large retailer induces the closure of nearly 20% of the small groceries in the same area in the 5 years after the retailer opens. The authors of the study say this proves, with quantifiable data, that general perception that large retailers encroach upon mom-and-pop shops. They added that negative impact that large retailers have had on small shops has been reduced somewhat since 2008, when the government began instituting more active regulations against large retailers.
Well, it appears Korea's head coach Hong Myung-mo will stay in his job despite a disappointing Brazil World Cup in which the team turned in its worst result in 16 years with 1 draw and 2 losses, yes, no win.
Well, in a press conference Thursday, the Korea Football Association said it was not fair to heap all the blame on Hong for not achieving their widely slated goal of advancing to the knockout stages. Hong will likely remain in the role until his contract expires after next year's Asian Cup.
Right, appointed to lead the national team less than 1 year before the World Cup, Hong came under fire for selecting players he has worked with closely in the past, despite their poor form or lack of match time at their clubs. The former defender, who helped Korea place 4th at the 2002 World Cup, took charge of the younger squad in the late 2000s, leading them to the bronze at the 2012 London Olympics. Well, from South Korea-China relations to a relationship between a high-profile Chinese actress and a well-known Korean director.
Chinese movie star Tang Wei and Korean director Kim Tae-young, they are tying the knot. The news has taken China by storm since being announced Wednesday. The nation's biggest portal site, Shinna.com, which first reported the story, had more than 200,000 comments on the engagement as of Thursday afternoon. Some were witty, including one that said Tang Wei was President Xi Jinping's present to Korea, while others asked for Korean actor Kim Soo-hyun, who is enormously popular in China, in return. Tang and Kim first became friends on set of Kim's 2010 movie, Late Autumn.
Well, how lovely about that. But moving on to another topic, a theatrical performance dealing with the horrors faced by the Korean victims of Japan's system of wartime sex slavery has opened here in Korea.
The drama's Japanese creator says the Japanese government cannot have a clear conscience accusing the victims of being liars when there is so much evidence to prove otherwise. Here's our Park Geun-hye.
In this monologue play, former wartime sex slave Young Ja recounts her life story. When she was young, Korea was under the Japanese colonial rule, and she was sent to Japan thinking she was going to work in a factory. Upon her arrival, however, she was forced into sexual slavery. She was just 14 years old. The play's creator says the piece is titled Liar Young Ja, as it accuses the Japanese government of making former sex slaves liars.
Through the play, I aim to criticize the Abe administration. As you can see on this stage backdrop, I posted the face of Prime Minister Abe to criticize the administration's recent moves.
80-year-old veteran Japanese playwright Fujita Asaya says he wanted to tell the truth with a play that's written based on facts and research, as he couldn't bear to watch the Japanese government conceal the obvious truth. Despite threats from far-right extremists in Japan, the play was performed in 1995. But Asaya is furious that nothing much changed in almost 2 decades.
It's basically the same as 20 years ago. In fact, the situation in Japan has gotten worse. I'm so angry. I want the Korean people to know that there are many more angry Japanese people like myself.
The monodrama will be staged in major cities in Korea this year and will be put on stage in China later this year. Asaya plans to take the show to other countries as well, including the Philippines and Japan, and some European countries in the years to come. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Well, let's turn our attention to the weather for a moment, and our Michelle Park is at the Weather Center for an update. Michelle, we had on and off showers here in Seoul today.
And right now, those showers are in the off position, but we're expecting more rain throughout the night.
Well, not the most welcoming conditions for our very important visitor, Chinese President Xi Jinping. Well, Michelle, are we expecting more rain tomorrow?
Well, as of right now, rain isn't in the forecast for Friday, which is tomorrow. Instead, we can expect mostly cloudy skies with higher daytime temperatures up into the low 30s. And since we're now in the monsoon season, more rain is expected throughout the weekend as well. Now, going over to our temperature readings, Seoul will top out at 21 in the morning and reach up to 31 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will peak up to 28 and 26 degrees. And moving over to other regions, Jeju Island will top out at 25, Dokdo hits at 22, while Mankungang tops out at 23. Well, that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and back to you guys.
Thank you for that, Michelle. These are the stories we're following at this hour. Although that's the end of our regularly scheduled newscast, but that's not all. Do stay with us.
Right, and as noted at the beginning of our broadcast, in a few minutes we are expecting President Park Geun-hye and Chinese President Xi Jinping to start their joint press conference following a bilateral summit earlier this afternoon, and we will be back with our special programming right after this. Welcome back. For those of you just joining us, you are watching Arirang News special coverage of the Korea-China bilateral summit. President Park Geun-hye and visiting Chinese President Xi Jinping sat down for a one-on-one at the nation's top office just hours ago, or minutes ago, in fact. And we are expecting the two leaders to hold a joint news conference very shortly.
Not as shortly as we anticipated, which is a good thing. They have plenty to discuss. The Chinese leader arrived in Seoul earlier this Thursday for a two-day visit that holds significance in various respects.
Right, and joining us live in the studio for some perspective along the way is Dr. Lee Jung-min, Ambassador for National Security Affairs and Professor of International Relations at Seoul-based Yonsei University. Ambassador Lee, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so Chinese President Xi Jinping is somewhat breaking with tradition by visiting as the sitting president to the Korean Peninsula, to Seoul first before North Korea. And some see this as a strong sign of displeasure out of Beijing. What's your take on that?
I think it's basically a very happy coincidence on our part. President Xi Jinping is visiting South Korea for the first time as the state president of China. He's here with his wife. And you're absolutely right, Kim Jong-un has not visited China since he was elevated as a leader. And Xi Jinping, unlike his predecessors, chose to come to Seoul rather than Pyongyang. But I think he wanted to convey a very strong message to the outside world. Given what North Korea is, a very fragile state with nuclear weapons and very uncertain political systems, China wants to keep a distance from Pyongyang. And by doing so, he has elevated new ties with South Korea.
Well, insecure is one way of putting North Korea right now, and we kind of poked them the wrong way by, well, China did it by choosing to visit us instead of them. They are looking to get a little bit more attention from China and Korea. Well, this is the fifth time in 1 year that the two leaders, South Korea's President Park Geun-hye and Xi Jinping, meeting since they came into office. Of course, big topic of discussion is North Korea. How strong of wording do you expect the two leaders to exchange regarding the matter?
Well, we'll have to wait until the press conference and the formal statement comes up. But my hunch is that the two leaders will reiterate what they've said before, namely that both the PRC and the South Korean government, we want to see a denuclearized Korean peninsula. I'd be very surprised if China comes out with a direct wording on North Korea without nuclear weapons. But the Chinese have said very clearly for the last several years, North Korea must go down the path of denuclearization for peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, which is something that Xi Jinping will reaffirm, I hope, at this summit.
Well, wording is a very important thing in diplomatic relations, I suppose. And, you know, China has repeatedly said that they want a nuclear-free Korean peninsula.
Right.
And they have never pinpointed, like you said, North Korea specifically. So we were hoping to see a change there, but your hunch is that they will not come up with that.
But, you know, one of the things you must see is that in previous, for example, summit meetings and what the Chinese have said, they've used the word very carefully. They said both sides reaffirm, for example, the need to go down the path of denuclearization and from developing nuclear capabilities. And that's a code word for developing North Korean nuclear weapons, because obviously South Korea doesn't have nuclear weapons. The Americans withdrew all tactical nuclear weapons from the early 1990s. So that's basically what the Chinese are saying, but in diplomatic form. Because they want to also tell the entire international community that China has no interest in seeing North Korea or even a unified Korea with nuclear weapons.
Now, also topping the agenda today, we are expecting would be Japan, especially in light of the Japanese cabinet recently approving a shift or landmark change in security policy, which would allow them for the military to fight overseas. Of course, South Korea and China have been butting heads with Japan over territorial and historical issues. Do we expect the two leaders to have made some headway in their response against Tokyo?
I think in diplomacy, there's a combination of what you see between the two leaders in terms of their body language, formal statements, and the timing of the visit. I don't think it makes sense from a political point of view to always side with China on a so-called anti-Japan coalition, because we have strategic interests with the Japanese as well. But as everybody knows, the Chinese have huge territorial and historical disputes with China, with Japan. We have outstanding historical problems with the Japanese. And the two sides see eye to eye on almost virtually every single historical issue. So there's no need for us to push this into the face of Japan. But I think the Japanese understand very clearly, Xi Jinping has not visited Japan. President Park Geun-hye has not visited Japan. Neither China or Korea has opened doors to the Japanese leadership. This in itself shows that both China and Korea are singing from the same sheet of music when it comes to the issue of history.
Well, one subject that is probably not too touchy-feely for both sides are probably eager to talk about economic cooperation, the economic front. We've had free trade negotiations starting a couple of years ago in 2012. And this time, many feel that it could be a chance for them to put the icing on the cake. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, maybe, again, we'll have to see exactly what the two leaders agree. But I believe that our negotiators have said we are coming fairly close to an agreement. And perhaps the best outcome will be an FTA that will be signed by the end of this year. So I don't think the two leaders will be able to sign an FTA agreement at this particular summit, although they will basically move very close on a number of fronts. For example, the fact that we are able to see forward movement on investment growth between China and South Korea. There are other outstanding issues that have a bearing on the FTA, such as discussions on the maritime border in the Western Sea. So those are all issues that have to be worked out in the next several months.
I suppose trade relations is one front that South Korea and China see really eye to eye, that they need to boost their bilateral trade relations there. But going back to Japan for a little bit, are we sensing an unusual shift of paradigm in Northeast Asia from the post-Cold War front of South Korea, US, Japan being one side versus China and North Korea? Especially this morning, we heard that the Japanese would lift some sanctions, unilateral sanctions on North Korea, and we're seeing them two cozying up a little bit.
Yes, I think you bring out a very important point. From a South Korean perspective, one of our most important strategic interests is to see a unified Korea, and hopefully a unified Korea that is free and prosperous. In order for us to achieve that type of unified Korea, we need the help of our neighbors, in particular China. And in that sense, we will see the Chinese as we do, not as a Cold War relic, but as one of our strongest economic and over the longer term strategic partners. So for us, it is not either China or the US. We've got to have good ties with both Washington and Beijing. But I think Korea is very unique because we are one of the very few countries in Asia, if not in the world, that has really, really core interests both with the US and China. And I think it makes eminent sense for Korea to tell the world we have core interests that we have to share with the Chinese, and that's the way it's going to be for the next several decades.
Right. We are still waiting for that joint news conference to happen between Presidents Park and Xi, and we will be back with you, Ambassador Lee. Thank you so much. But before that, before sitting down with President Park today, Chinese President Xi offered his thoughts on the summit in a piece that, of course, appeared in Korea's major dailies on this Thursday.
It encouraged greater cooperation between Seoul and Beijing and expressed high hopes for the summit, echoing the sentiments voiced by President Park a day earlier in her interview with Chinese broadcaster CCTV. Here's Arirang.
Chinese President Xi Jinping begins his piece with a traditional Korean saying, "It only costs 3 straw bags to buy a house, but 1,000 to get a good neighbor," emphasizing the importance of having good neighbors. He goes on to say that Seoul and Beijing have been able to build a healthy relationship based on trust, adding the two should always be able to freely exchange opinions on areas of mutual interest. President Xi also calls economic cooperation the main focal point of Korea-China relations and says China is aiming to expand its economic ties with Seoul through speedy negotiations on their bilateral FTA. As for his visit to Seoul, he writes that he hopes the two leaders will share friendship, discuss cooperation, and preserve peace. His words were echoed a day earlier by Korean President Park Geun-hye during an interview with China's CCTV, where she expressed hope that the visit will bring relations between the two to a new high.
이번에 시 주석님의 방한도 더욱 그 내실화 있는 결실을 많이 거둬서 두 나라 관계의 신뢰와 또 우호 관계가 더욱 깊어지리라 그렇게 생각합니다.
When asked about Korea's ongoing historical dispute with Japan, President Park simply said Tokyo needs to have a correct understanding of history. She also accused Tokyo of trying to undermine the 1993 Kono Statement, which was its official apology for forcing roughly 200,000 women into sexual slavery during World War II.
국가 간의 신뢰를 저버리는 일이고 또 국제사회의 그 준엄한 그런 그 어떤 목소리를 무시하는 그런 행위라고 생각을 합니다. 그래서 일본은 이제라도 어떻게 역사의 수레바퀴를 되돌릴 수는 도저히 없는 것이기 때문에
Japan's recent attempts to revise history and economic cooperation between China and Korea will top the agenda of the summit between the two leaders. Yurian, Arirang News.
Well, now on the sidelines of their summit, Korea and China were expected to ink a deal to allow direct trading of their local currencies.
Right, of course, business and trade is top on the agenda for the Chinese president and the large business delegation that he is traveling with. And one was the slashing of transaction costs for companies on either side of the West Sea and reduce foreign exchange risks. Here's our Kim Ji-yeon.
Korea and China have been trying to settle their exports and imports in their own currencies in light of their growing trade. China is Korea's largest trading partner, while Korea is China's third largest trading partner. Last year, the trade volume between the two countries totaled $230 billion, with Korea posting a $63 billion surplus. Up until now, only 1% of Korean companies settle their trading bills with their Chinese partners directly in the Chinese yuan, because only those already holding enough yuan could do so. Under the currency deal, exporters and importers from the two countries will no longer have to pay transaction fees when converting the won to the yuan, and vice versa, since there's no need to convert into the US dollar. The new arrangement is expected to cut Korean traders' business costs by at least 3 to 5%. It would also help reduce potential exchange rate risk. A researcher at the Korea Capital Market Institute says the deal will make Korea's financial market more attractive to foreign investors as well.
The deal with China is expected to enhance Korea's financial and industrial brand image with the growing use of the yuan in international trade.
The global trade volume settled in the yuan amounted to 4.6 trillion yuan, or $741 billion last year, up 58% from a year earlier. In addition to the currency deal, China is reportedly considering allowing Korean financial institutions to invest directly in China's capital markets by granting them investment quotas of up to $13 billion. China has similar quota deals with Britain, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
Well, the media spotlight is not just on President Xi, but also on his wife, who is accompanying him on this trip to Seoul.
Well, she is almost as well known as her husband, if not more, and her fashion style in particular has made headlines around the world. Our Song Ji-sun has more on China's First Lady.
She is the Michelle Obama of the world's second largest economy and has been referred to as the Carla Bruni of China for her past career in entertainment. It's Chinese First Lady Peng Liyuan who was once more famous than her husband for her regular appearances in an annual CCTV New Year's gala. Unlike her predecessors, the former singer and performer has been outgoing and active in her role as China's First Lady. The world's 57th most powerful woman, according to Forbes magazine, is also a goodwill ambassador for the World Health Organization. Selected to the International Best Dressed by Vanity Fair magazine last year, everything Peng wears makes headlines in fashion magazines and immediately sells out. Peng is scheduled to visit palaces in the Korean capital and attend cultural events during her 2-day visit, and will be on her own for most of her itinerary while her husband holds talks. To show around the city, the presidential office of Cheongwade has tapped current senior secretary for political affairs Cho Yun-sun, who will serve as Peng's personal tour guide during her stay. 송지선, Arirang News.
All right, welcome back. So for those of you just joining us, you are watching Arirang News special coverage of the Korea-China Bilateral Summit News Conference. And we will be giving you a live feed of President Park Geun-hye and visiting Chinese President Xi Jinping's joint news conference, but we're still waiting for that to happen.
Right, it'll take some time as we are accustomed to such grand events that involve two heads of states exchanging ideas and formulating some solution to some global issues involving both sides. And now we will turn to an expert to provide his insights on what we can expect from this possible adventure between the two countries.
Okay, so Ambassador Lee rejoins us. Now, Ambassador Lee, we just looked at the First Lady, China's First Lady, and her profile. And it's rather unusual that the Chinese president is traveling with his wife on a state visit, right?
This is the first time that President Xi Jinping has brought his wife to South Korea, of course. Previous Chinese presidents have done this, but none have been as visually, I guess, attractive or even, doing, for example, soft power diplomacy as much as Mrs. Xi Jinping. And the reason is because if you look at the past, for example, during the era of the Soviet Union, Mr. Gorbachev, his wife, Raisa Gorbachev, was the first attractive first lady to come out onto the world scene. And she wowed the American press. And the Soviets gained so much mileage out of this. And I think in this perspective, the Chinese have basically used the First Lady as a very powerful diplomatic asset for China. And she basically shows the Chinese, look, here's a career woman who rose up the ranks of the PLA as a major singer. She had her own career. She is one of China's most recognized icons in the music industry. She's a very popular opera artist. And that she has now joined the president on a state visit to Korea really speaks miles about how China has come in terms of their soft power diplomacy.
Right, soft diplomacy, always important to have an open arm than a clenched fist. And of course, she is doing a great job of playing her role in that sense.
But what kind of a significance do we see from the Korean side, that from the Korean public's view, is this going to help Koreans' sentiment towards China?
Well, there's a plus and a minus. The plus, obviously, is that as the Chinese have greater economic interest and exchange in South Korea, more than 70,000 students, South Korean students study, for example, in China today. A similar number, a little bit lower, studies here in Korea. There are some 800,000 Chinese residents in Korea working part-time, and about 680,000 Koreans in China. So there's a very intensive people-to-people exchange. So in that sense, I think the First Lady in a visit to Seoul will add a very human face to Chinese foreign policy. But it doesn't mean that Koreans don't have anxieties over other issues with the Chinese, whether it's economic or military.
I understand you have some very fascinating numbers showing that Koreans, as we grow closer with China, we seem to have some underlying fears of what this relationship could develop to, more competition, more threats for South Korea.
For example, the Asan Institute for Policy Studies just came out with a poll 2 days ago on the burgeoning Korean-Chinese relationship. And Koreans have a very high-level view of China and its leadership. Right after, for example, the US is China. So in that sense, it's quite good. And when Koreans were asked, what is the relationship with the Chinese under President Park, 62% said very good, it'll improve to 70%. And then when they asked Koreans, is China a competitor or a partner, 60% said cooperative. But look at this. When they asked, is China a military threat, 66% say yes. And not because China is a direct threat to South Korea, it's because of China's ties with North Korea, the fact that there could be a regional arms race, and a potential clash between the US and China. So the Koreans have a very, very realistic view of the Chinese from a security point. On economic issues, as much as we have deepening ties with China, look at this. In 2006, only 40% that China was an economic threat. In this newest poll, 72% of Koreans believe China is an economic threat. So Koreans see China both as a huge opportunity, as a huge, gateway for economic opportunity, but at the same time as a challenge and also as an economic threat. So this is something that Koreans really have. Just one more, which is really interesting. When we ask South Koreans, will China help North Korea in a war? Only 35% of South Koreans believe the Chinese will help North Korea in another war. So in that sense, Korea has a very, very, mixed view of what the Chinese mean to us.
So basically a love and fear relationship there.
That's right.
That's how South Koreans view China.
Right.
Let's talk about North Korea a little bit. I mean, North Korea obviously feels a little bit left out in all of this. And it has been, making itself, vocal that, we're here and by firing missiles and rockets and whatnot. So in your view, what's running in the mind of North Korean leader Kim Jong-un right now as he sees at this summit?
He has done everything possible to increase North Korea's foreign policy capital, but without making huge change, which is virtually impossible to do. So he chose opening ties with the Japanese as one facet of giving North Korea more political space. But what's really happening here? The real story in the Korean Peninsula and China is this. In the Cold War, North Korea and China were very close allies, and for political and strategic reasons. Today, China is so much bigger, so much more powerful. China is a global player that she has outgrown North Korea. It's simple as that. So although North Korea is developing nuclear weapons, she's flying missiles, and she's doing all sorts of things, China believes that it is time to move on beyond their North Korea portfolio. They will not drop North Korea. North Korea is considered still to be a very close partner of the Chinese. But the most important shift is this. The Chinese government has said explicitly North Korea is no longer an ally of China. So this is a very big shift. So the Chinese military leadership and their diplomatic leadership have said very carefully, when Koreans ask them, but you have an alliance with the North Koreans, they say, we have a very close relationship, but no longer is North Korea an ally, which means China is not going to be automatically involved should there be another major crisis on the Korean Peninsula. So there has been lots of very subtle but important changes in how China sees North Korea. And if you look at the overall trade between South Korea and China, it completely dwarfs what North Korea does with the Chinese. Their annual trade with China is about $5 billion. Our annual trade with China is over $220 billion. And once you sign an FTA between Beijing and Seoul, the trade will be even bigger. So in that sense, the Chinese realize that the future of the Korean Peninsula really belongs to the Republic of Korea and managing ties with South Korea down the road.
So as for a unified Korea, what in your view is China's perspective or China's take on seeing this reunification happening on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, they've only said over the last 10 years or so very, very general principles on unification. They support a peaceful, unified Korea that is able to coexist in prosperity with the other countries of the region. But they have not said deliberately or specifically what a unified Korea will be. For example, will it be a country that will have strong security ties with the US? Will it be a country that will have, for example, outstanding political ties with, for example, the Chinese? Those are all issues that at some future point we must negotiate with our neighbors. But I think the Chinese realize over time that, if you talk to Chinese specialists on the Korean Peninsula, many of them now believe that North Korea is increasingly being seen as a liability rather than an asset. And I asked a Chinese scholar, very well known in the region, I said, well, let me be very blunt with you. I said, name me 3 of your best friends in Asia. And he said, well, it's North Korea, Pakistan, and maybe Myanmar or Burma. And I said, well, with friends like those, that's fine. But if you look at South Korea's friends in the region, it's the US, for example, in the Western Pacific. We have ties with Australia, Japan, ASEAN, India, and the list goes on.
Right.
So in that sense, the Chinese realize that in the future, having a very strong relationship with Korea is a huge asset to the Chinese.
Well, one thing that South Korea and China have in common is that at one point they decided this is where we are and that is where we want to go, and they need to break something down and make the change. But one thing about North Korea is they just want to get there without realizing where they stand. Is there a chance that North Korea might someday make that drastic change that's necessary to join the rest of the world so that they can evolve and get a greater relationship going on?
This is what everybody has wanted for the last 20, 30 years. If you recall what China was like before the reform era in 1978, China was isolationist, very bitter about the outside world. She had fought wars here in Korea, and there was virtually no contact with the outside world. Its economy was very backwards. Look what has happened in the last 30, 40 years. You've seen a huge sea change in China. It is now the world's second largest economy. Its citizens travel all over the world. You see droves of Chinese tourists all over South Korea today. And this has happened only in 30, 40 years. So of course, China believes North Korea should change like them, or even like Vietnam. But the key is this. In China, you had a complete break with Mao's era, under Deng Xiaoping and successive leaders. In North Korea, it's the same Kim dynasty. You have Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. So I think it is politically very difficult for Kim Jong-un to make a complete break with his past. Because in order for him to start afresh, he has to blame someone, and he can't blame his grandfather or his father for the situation North Korea is in. So Kim Jong-un has a huge dilemma, much bigger than for example, Deng Xiaoping. So in that perspective, yes, North Korea should go down the line of reforms and opening up, but Kim Jong-un wants to have both. He wants to reform North Korea and also have nuclear weapons, which is something that everybody in the region disagrees with.
Let's talk about U.S. a little bit. We're very sure that the U.S. is keeping a close watch on this South Korea-China summit. It has been, eerie a little bit about this, close ties between President Park Geun-hye and President Xi Jinping. What is the U.S. thinking right now, watching this summit?
Over the last several years, particularly after the inauguration of the Park Geun-hye government, Americans have been concerned that Korean ties with Japan is in a deep freeze, whereas our ties with China are improving by the day. And as a result, what has happened from an American perspective is that the US, Japan, Korean trilateral security cooperation perhaps has become a bit weaker than in the past. And maybe there is a certain truth in such a perception, but I always tell my American friends, both in government and outside, that if you look at Korea's strategic interest, especially whether it's North Korea's nuclear weapons, our ties with China over the longer term, having a more prosperous Northeast Asia and the Eurasian landmass, we have no choice but to have very close ties with China. And for us, it is not an option. This is one thing that the world and our American friends must understand. We are becoming closer with China because it is in our national interest, and it is in the national interest of China to do so. It doesn't mean it's going to come at the expense of our ties with Americans. We're both democracies, we share human rights, and so forth. But from now on down the road, we must tell both our American friends and our Japanese friends that we will have close ties with both all of you, but also with the PRC.
Well, shifting gears to a different subject now, we were talking about how change is necessary. China continues to evolve, so does South Korea.
Yes.
And I think one thing we need to do is, in terms of our trade relationship with China, China is no longer the factory of the world, and many people have acknowledged the fact. What kind of drastic changes should we make within Korea to make sure we move on to the next level in our trade relationship with China?
I was talking to a very prominent U.S. financial analyst some time ago, and he said, he made a bet with me. He said, in 10 years' time, everything that Korea makes, automobiles, cell phones, TV monitors, everything, the Chinese will make even better. I said, well, maybe in 10 years' time that's going to happen. What he was saying was that South Korea has to basically develop a new strategy, because if you become too dependent on the Chinese market, all of our exports goes head and tails towards the Chinese market. And Chinese companies are catching up technologically with South Korea very rapidly. So he said, what does South Korea have that you can offer to the world that the Chinese will not be able to also offer, but at a much cheaper price. And that is the $64,000 question for the South Korean economy. And so I would argue, whether it's green growth, whether it's having more intellectual software companies, I think the fact that we have to be more innovative and creative is the biggest advantage we have as a democracy and open society versus, for example, the PRC today.
So we need to diversify our export items and whatnot in order to stay competitive in the global market, especially in the face of China.
That's right, but not just the China market, but we have to make products that the world will buy from us and not from, for example, our competitors, whether it's Japan or China. So whether it's in the software engineer industry, whether it's in medical care, for example, or education, those are all areas where Korea has a very strong advantage in. I believe those are key industries where in the future Korea can outshine the Chinese in certain respects.
Well, we are at a point in most Korean industries that's leading the global rankings, in a point where we feel that if we make it, they'll buy it.
Right.
And we need to change that attitude pretty soon, because China is right there following us, trailing us.
Right, catching up with us. Now, so speaking of the economy, Chinese President Xi Jinping is traveling with a huge business delegation, and they will actually be holding a joint business forum tomorrow on Friday as well. Why is he traveling with such a big business delegation? What does he aim to achieve from that?
The role of a leader, whether it's China or Korea, in many respects is basically salesman in chief. So he has to make sure that he's out there showing the world that he is doing everything possible to increase Chinese market share in the world. Why is this important? If the Chinese economy, which today grows at about 7%, which is very, very high, but if it begins to drop, even 1 or 2%, it will have a huge impact on the creation of jobs in China. And for the Chinese government, this is a huge political issue. And so it is critical for Xi Jinping to make sure that more Korean companies invest, for example, in China. There are about many, many hundreds of Korean firms. We have invested about over $70 billion in China. But the return investment from China to South Korea is still quite small, about $6.5 billion. But Xi Jinping has to show the Chinese, first of all, that he's doing everything possible to entice Koreans to do more investments in China. And he's done that by bringing in some of the leading CEOs of the Chinese economy.
Now, and do we expect this new won-yuan currency market that they will be inking the deal today? Do we expect that to help more investments in China and vice versa?
Yes, because business transactions, you want to basically minimize opportunity costs, and one of the great opportunity costs is giving or buying things from a third currency, whether it's the EU, or whether it's the euro or the US dollar. If Korean companies can deal directly and sell our goods to the Chinese in won, or buy things in the Chinese yuan market, for example, that basically is a yuan to won exchange without any middle persons or organizations. And in that sense, it would, I think, create new opportunities for both Korean and Chinese companies.
Well, right now, with all the things that's going on, the discussions, the possible deals to be inked between Korea and China, one little kid at the playground that's not able to get into the jungle gym and watching from afar is the U.S. How are they reacting, and how would they respond to some of more, I would say, more substantial deals that's reached today?
Oh, well, I think, in these visits, as big as the fanfare is and everything else, what I usually call summit meetings is what I use the word FIT. F stands for form, I basically is issues, and T is timing. So if all three get together, it's basically a very good fit, you see. But should we expect huge billions of dollars seeping into the Korean market tomorrow? Absolutely not. These business deals take weeks, if not months. Political leaders want to show both their governments and their citizens, hey, we're doing something very substantive. But these deals, to trickle down to the market takes many, many months, if not years.
Well, another issue that Korea, South Korea, and China see eye to eye is their historical, position against Japan. And without a doubt, the two leaders will be discussing their joint counterattack against Japan. Of course, Japan just recently reviewed its 1993 Kono Statement, which was key in their acknowledgement of the forced sexual slavery during World War II. What do we expect the two leaders to say to Japan? Do we expect them to pinpoint Japan and have a joint statement towards them?
Well, I'd be very surprised if they did, simply because I think the Chinese and the Korean leadership realizes that just by being together, it shows the outside world how different the Chinese and the Koreans are vis-a-vis Japan. And on specific historical issues, I think whether it's over the Senkaku disputes between China and Japan, for example, the outstanding Tokdo issue that we have for the Japanese, or historical debate, all of these issues will take a long time to get figured out. But I think the most important point is this. China and South Korea stand shoulder to shoulder, not only on sexual slavery, on Japan's aggression in World War II, on keeping the Kono and Murayama statements. And basically it comes down to this. The Japanese can apologize till they turn face, till their face turns blue, but what the Chinese and Koreans want is deep sincerity. And what Abe has shown by, reinterpreting the Kono statement without disregarding it, was saying, look, we will keep the letter of the Kono statement intact, but we will tell the Japanese people that this was a political document. So what has he done? In reality, he has watered it down. This is what the Chinese disagree with.
Another issue on the Japanese front is, of course, Japan's reinterpretation of its pacifist constitution. And that, of course, is met by opposition by both South Korea and China because we have both fallen victim to Japan's colonization and invasions. Do we expect the two leaders to discuss that as well?
Well, as I said, this will be part of, I guess if they did discuss this issue, they will basically phrase it in more general terms. Japan's collective self-defense is a term that means that if Japan, or its ally in particular, the US, for example, is attacked by a third country, then Japan has the right to use military forces. And the Abe government now believes that she has the right to do so by reinterpreting Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. And this deeply worries the Chinese and the Koreans for the reasons that you have just pointed out. Just a couple of days ago, there was a trilateral meeting between the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the US, Korea, and Japan in Hawaii. And our military chief said basically very clearly, Japan's collective self-defense cannot apply to South Korea, period, unless and until they have full approval from us. So the Japanese can do nothing in Korea or in our waters or airspace without explicit prior permission from us. So we make that very, very clear. That's our government position. And the Korean government feels very strongly that yes, Japan can play a positive role in peacekeeping in the UN and so forth, but when it comes to rearmament, when it comes to remilitarization, those are all issues we watch Japan very, very carefully.
Well, Japan is always trying to find a way to stick a big foot in the door in terms of being military prepared and ready to jump into any possible battle or war-related activities. The ambition, is it possible for any opposition within or outside the country to sort of intervene and put in more pressure to make them go back to how they used to be?
Well, I think that is a political decision the Japanese have to make. There's no way that we can force the Abe government to go back, and I think that is politically impossible to do. But as we discuss this issue, one other thing, very important thing is happening. China is playing a very important role in the region militarily, and many Asian states believe that China is a semi-threat to them, particularly in South China Seas. So the reason why the Japanese are moving forward on this issue is because many Asian countries, the Philippines in particular, feel that they are much weaker in front of very aggressive China in the South China Seas. So as a result, the Americans and the Japanese believe their strong alliance can be enhanced by Japan's collective self-defense, and some Southeast Asian countries agree with them. Of course, our belief is different from the Japanese or the ASEAN countries. But that's the reality that we have to cope with today.
China is one way of Japan of justifying their upgrade of military capabilities.
Right. For example, so the Philippine government has said on many occasions that they welcome a very strong and robust Japanese role in the security arena. Why? Because the Philippines believes that a strong Japan could help counterbalance the Chinese in the South China Seas. But as I said, this is a view that the Philippines may have, but we have a very different view given our history with the Japanese.
Well, we are still waiting for that joint news conference to happen. For those of you just joining us, this is Arirang News special coverage of a Korea-China summit joint news conference. Presidents Xi and President Park Geun-hye are now still in their bilateral talks, and we will bring you that joint live coverage in just a little bit, but right after this break.